Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to this month's Portals Community Call. I'm Jason Gumpert from NMSDynamicsWorld.com. Pleased to be here to kick things off once again. We have Nick Hayduk here to present with all the new Portals news and to this month's focus topic, which I'm sure he will be getting into in more detail as well. As always, we do welcome your questions. Look for the questions block in the webcast interface. I know Nick will be keeping an eye on that as we go. And we're also recording today's event. So we will be providing that after the session ends. So without any further delay, I think we're ready to begin. And Nick, let me hand things off to you.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, morning, evening, everyone. Thanks as always for joining the call. I hope you're pumped about seeing how, what options we have for reports and dashboards on a portal. So why don't we get into it? All right, as always, quick intro here. My name is Nicholas Hayduk. I'm a Microsoft MVP and with engineered code based here in Regina, Saskatchewan, with a focus on Power Apps portals. I've been working with the product here for since 2009, so that makes me old. You've got my LinkedIn, my Twitter, my blog, my YouTube channel, podcasts, all very much portals focused. So please follow or link or whatever the cool kids are saying these days with any of those if you're interested. Always kind of happy to engage with the community to talk about Power Apps portals. All right. Next slide. As always, want to just say thank you, big thank you to Jason and the team at NMS Dynamics World. They do a great job on just kind of keeping the whole world up to date with their content, but specifically related to this community call. Since day one, Jason's been a great supporter, so just really happy to have them as a partner on these community calls. So thanks as always. Agenda, same as always. We'll get into some portal news, although, I think I mentioned on the last call how much news we were having, and of course I jinxed it because there wasn't a whole lot this month. Despite the fact that it's been kind of 5 or 6 weeks since our last call, not as many topics this time as there have been in other times. So news is a little bit shorter today. In terms of today's topic, again, we're going to talk about when someone comes to you and says, "Hey, I want a report or I want dashboards on a portal. What are your options?" Because there are a few options out there, so we'll kind of talk about what those are and maybe some of the gotchas that you should know about before you make any promises about how that might work on a portal. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. I think just because I'll just kind of warn you, when it comes to the Power BI side of things, which we will talk about, it's going to have to be more talk than show. And anytime we get into reporting, it's kind of difficult to get the environment set up properly. So I don't have like a live Power BI environment with Power BI embedded because it's expensive and not cheap. And it's not something where I could use in a client's implementation because that generally includes a bunch of proprietary data. So it's going to have to be kind of more talk and we kind of talk about the theory. Because honestly, it's really more the theory is important. The actual dropping on the page is a liquid tag, so it's not that big of a deal. So, but today's call might be a little shorter than usual because there's not a ton of like building on it. And then, yeah, we'll have time for Q&A. So, like I said, news pretty light this month. I scoured my regular technique is to just kind of go over Twitter for the last month and see what was out there. And to be honest, I didn't find much. So the one thing I did see is that the PWA, so the Progressive Web App for portals, is generally available. I'll be honest with you folks, the PWA is not something that excites me a whole lot. I think in the use cases that we have in portals, I don't know how many people are going to be using this. It's really cool to talk about and to think of as a feature where it says, hey, you can kind of create an app out of your portal. But realistically, if your app needs to talk to data in Dataverse, which is kind of the whole point of a portal, it doesn't work offline. So people say, oh, it works offline. Well, the content pages can work offline, but the actual forms and grids and all that, forms and lists don't. So I don't know. I'm a little I'm not so hot on the PWA, but other people are, so want to share that news that's what's out there. But honestly, beyond that, I didn't really have much else in terms of news. So that's why the segment this month is pretty short. Hopefully, as we're getting closer to the April, kind of the next release wave, there'll be kind of more that's, something from the notes that the release notes that we've talked about, maybe those will start lighting up. But yeah, a little bit of a quieter month. So, I mean, that's okay. The Microsoft product team needs a break sometime too from all the announcements. So, okay, let's talk about our topic for today, which is displaying reports and dashboards on a portal. This is a super common request. I mean, it's almost like every single portal that we ever work on, someone wants to display some sort of dashboard or report on the portal. And in terms of the dashboard, often it's like, okay, when someone logs into the portal for the first time, what does the home screen look like? And often it's some sort of dashboard view, whether it's a list of their cases or whatever that portal is about. That homepage is often something we would just call a dashboard, right? Like it has links to places, or it might have some, here's latest cases, some stats, whatever it is. Those would be displayed on your homepage of your portal. So when you get those types of requirements, what are your options? I'm going to broadly kind of group it into three areas. So the first option is to use Power BI. And this is probably, if you were to ask Microsoft, that's probably the main way that they're going to tell you to go is Power BI. And we do Power BI all the time now. I mean, in terms of like integrating to a portal, it's a pretty common thing these days. I don't know, if I were to guess, like probably 50% of the portals that we're working on these days have some sort of Power BI component. So I mean, Power BI is a cool technology, and we'll get into kind of what the gotchas are with using Power BI, but it's definitely a popular way of doing things. Power BI is not free, so if people are looking for a more low-cost solution or something more out of the box within portals, it's very common for us to build out a dashboard or reports using Liquid. So using a combination of charts, lists, and fetch XML, or I mean, we haven't done this too much because it's relatively recent, but the web API now allows read operations. So it is something that you could, in theory, do with the web API as well. Although historically, like I said, we're more in the Liquid, doing Liquid. So the third option that I'm not really going to investigate because we don't really do it, but I will just say, obviously it's an option, is like, Microsoft has Power BI, but there's other, I'm sure, third-party tools that could potentially get integrated. So whether that's, I don't know, Tableau or whatever the other competitors out there, again, we haven't done it, but it's certainly an option. And we will chat about, what you might want to think about if that were to, if you're going to go down that road. So those are the three things we're going to be looking at today. And so let's get into the first one here, which is Power BI. Like I said, Power BI, a super popular way of adding reports to a portal. But I would say it's also a super confusing, like it's a super point of confusion for people. They don't really know what they're getting into when they do it. And whether it's from a licensing perspective or just a technology perspective, the way it's kind of could be sold sometimes is, oh yeah, it just supports Power BI. You can just drop Power BI on there. And it's like, yeah, it's true, but like Power BI is a very complicated, it's like the licensing is complicated, and like the technologies are like, there's lots of different options. So yeah, does it support Power BI? Absolutely. But unless you're a Power BI expert, you may just, it can easily get oversimplified. So when you're using Power BI, the first thing to know is that the way Power BI gets onto a portal is very simple. There's a Power BI Liquid tag that you can use. It literally just says Power BI, and then you essentially give it the URL to the report in Power BI that you want to display. So that's kind of the easy part. There's also within the Portal Studio, there's now a component that, like, so when you're going to add components the same way you can add forms or an HTML block or that sort of thing, you can add the Power BI report that way as well. And actually, that's kind of a nice way to do it, especially if we're getting into Power BI embedded, which we'll talk about here in a second, because you don't have to figure out what the ID is of your report in your workspace and that sort of thing. Like it kind of does that work for you. So within Power BI, like I said, there's three ways. So within that liquid tag, essentially what you have to figure out is how are the users on your portal going to be authenticated to Power BI? Because Power BI has different ways, and so when you're looking at a report, often you want to look at it in the context of a user. You don't just have the same report that every user sees. You kind of want to give them a report that's tailored to them. So 3 options for embedding a report, and these line up with the authentication mechanism which exists on the Power BI tag, the liquid tag. So the first one is publish to web. This is the easy one because it actually doesn't require authentication. So any, if you've got Power BI, you've got the licenses, Power BI Pro to create custom reports, you can do what they call publish to web. And what that does is it generates a URL for that report that anyone who has that URL can go and see. It's really kind of that simple. You publish your report, that URL is what people can see, and you can then take that URL and embed it on your portal. And essentially what it'll do is it will iframe that report onto your portal. However, with that technique, there's no authentication. So everyone who goes to that URL will see the same report. Now there are some caveats to that, but in general, like there's no user information being passed from the portal to that report. So anyone who knows that URL can see the report. Now, I have seen some techniques where people will use that publish to web, and they will apply filtering to their report so that it's a little bit more. There's some context for who's logged in onto that who's logged into the portal on that report. So it is technically possible, but it is extremely unsecure. And that's because the techniques that are used to filter that report is in JavaScript. When you have that Power BI report on the page, you can use the client-side JavaScript APIs for Power BI to add filters to the report. And so that's what I've seen people do is they basically put the publish to web on the screen, and then they use JavaScript to apply some filtering. They say, oh, only show it for this particular user. The problem is anytime you're doing anything security-wise in JavaScript, you've got a problem because JavaScript is you can't enforce anything in JavaScript because the user can go into their browser and change the JavaScript to be whatever they want. So if you are applying the filtering to your Power BI report using JavaScript, someone can go and turn that off, and now that filtering doesn't exist. So now they see everyone's data. Or they change the filtering to apply to a different company, however you happen to do it. So to me, that's a huge security hole. It absolutely is a security hole, and to me, it's never a risk that I've been willing to take to say, oh, we'll just assume that users won't know how to turn off the JavaScript. Will most users? Probably not. But all it takes is one person who knows what they're doing, and you've got a mess. So publish to web is useful if you have more. Like for example, if you're building a portal and say you're in manufacturing and you want to give a report to everyone that's the same, that's just like the status of like how your systems are up right now. Like, so not the person who's signed in, but as a company, the company who's provided the portal, oh, you know what, 10 of our machines are up and you want to kind of give them a dashboard. And everyone's going to see the same dashboard and you don't really care whether it's public or not. Like anyone could kind of see that dashboard, then publish to web is great. But using publish to web to give reports that are specific to a user, unsecure, I wouldn't recommend it. So publish to web is often what would be used in a demo because it's like, hey, look, I can put Power BI in a portal. True, not as practical. We don't often see that in the real world where there is a report that doesn't need any sort of context about who's logged in. So great for demos, we don't see that widely used in the real world. All right, so option number 2 is Azure AD. So if you are building out something like an employee self-service portal, and you've built out a Power BI portal that's a Power BI report that internal employees should see. Then using Azure AD is an option so that it will essentially single sign on with Azure with Power Apps portals, because everything is Azure AD, and it will single sign on and it will show that report on the portal. But you have to be aware of the licensing implications of that, because essentially what you're doing is you're just taking a report that would be otherwise available to them in Power BI and you're embedding it on the portal. So you have to be licensed as if that person was accessing, PowerBI.com. So yes, this technique allows you to put a report on a portal. That portal, the user must be signed in with Azure AD, which generally means it's an internal user unless you're using guest accounts. And they need to have the proper licensing that they would need otherwise to see that report in Power BI. So this isn't really about giving more people access to Power BI because they would have it anyways, but it's about taking it and putting that report into a different place. So again, this is not something we see a lot of people doing because, I mean, yeah, we do some employee, like some internal portals. They certainly exist and they're out there. But I would say the vast majority of the portals that we work on are for external customers. So Azure AD just doesn't make a ton of sense because then you're basically creating all these guest accounts and it can get kind of ugly. So Azure AD is, again, an option that works well in a demo if you want to provide kind of in-context reports, but unless those users are internal in the live scenario, not as useful in as many situations. So that brings us to what is by far the most popular option that I've seen, which is using Power BI embedded. So the main challenge with Power BI embedded is the licensing cost. So it's a completely different licensing tier compared to the, I don't know, what is it, $5 or $10 a month for Power BI Pro or Premium. Once you get into Power BI embedded, it's more about purchasing. It's almost like purchasing a server, like you're purchasing a service that allows people to log in or view Power BI reports without being licensed. So if any of you are from the old Dynamics CRM days, where for a portal we used to have to buy what they called the external connector license, so which allowed people who were not part of the organization to connect to Dynamics and view a portal. It's kind of like the old external connector license where you buy this Power BI embedded service. They've got these kind of special dedicated resources for it, and so you're paying for those resources, and then you're no longer constrained to say only licensed Power BI users can use those resources. You're paying for the resources, and anyone that you kind of give access to can access those resources, including people on a portal. Now, it's not really that like it's the licensing that helps us out here, because on a portal, the vast majority of the time, your portal users are not going to be licensed for Power BI. So that's why we have to kind of go to this Power BI embedded tier to be following the licensing rules, because that's kind of the only way to have, to not have to have named users and give them access to Power BI. So it helps us from a licensing perspective, but it also helps us from a security perspective, because as soon as you start doing Power BI embedded, the portal will start passing to Power BI the username of the person who's logged in. So when you're building your Power BI embedded report, you can use row-level security to do the filtering necessary to show the reports in context of that user. So if you've never built a Power BI report, this may not mean anything to you. I'm very light on my Power BI experience. I've done a little bit, but not a whole ton. But essentially what it means is that when you're doing your row-level security, you have access to a DAX function that is username. And that's typically how you do your filtering of the records to say, okay, based on this username, we are going to filter the records. And so when you are integrating Power BI embedded with a portal, the portal, as part of the code that it puts on the page, will pass the username, which is defined in the ADX_identity_username column on the contact record. It will take whatever's in that for the contact record and pass it as the username to Power BI. So then you can do whatever filtering you need to do based on knowing who that contact is. So on Power BI, you essentially can figure out which contact is logged in based on that ADX_identity_username column. And then you can do whatever joins you need to actually do your filtering. So you might have your contact, you might have to join it to the account table. so based on its parent account, and that might give you some ID to do your filtering. So it really depends on whether you're doing Power BI reports that are based on Dynamics data or other external data, that sort of thing. But the key thing to know is that with Power BI embedded, you've got access to row level security, and you can do the ADX, and it's based on the ADX underscore identity username column on the contact. The actual setup of Power BI embedded is, it takes a few minutes. It's not a big deal. There's a few steps. It's very well documented. So at a high level, you have to go into the portal's admin center. You have to enable the Power BI visualizations. That's something I might be able to actually quickly show you here. Let's give that a try. So if I just go to make.powerapps.com, if I go into my right environment, if I go to apps, and I've got my portal here, and then I go to settings, and then I go to administration. Now, bear with me, this has been an incredible, like the last month, I don't know what's been so slow with this, so this may or may not work. But if I go to set up Power BI integration, essentially what you do is you have to enable the Power BI visualization. So for all three options that we talked about, whether it's the publish to web, Azure AD, or Power BI embedded, all three of those options, you have to enable Power BI visualization. And it's basically you click this, you say enable, and that's it. Not that hard. For the third option, which is Power BI embedded service, that's the one where you do have to enable it here. Once you're properly connected, and again, I don't have any workspaces, but you select your Power BI workspaces, and then you select them here, and you click enable, and it will enable it. But then what you have to do is you have to go to Power BI and basically give the portal access to those Power BI, to the Power BI workspaces. And so the way that you do that is you create a security group in Azure Active Directory. You use the application in Azure Active Directory that exists for this portal. So if you ever go to this page, your portal details, you'll see that there's this application ID, F15, whatever it is here. That is the application ID for our portal. And so that's the application, the app registration in Azure AD for this portal. And that's the app that's used to talk to Dynamics. It's what's going to be used to talk to SharePoint. And again, it's what can be used, and it's what used to talk to Power BI. So essentially what you do, and if you're not familiar with kind of app registrations, think of them, they're almost like a user account in Active Directory, but they're meant for kind of more like service users. So we take that application ID and we can add it as like you can add a user to a security group, you can add that application to the security group. So you create a security group, you add that user to that security group, and then you go into Power BI and you add that security group to the list of users or security groups that can access Power BI. And that's how you basically give Power BI, or you give the portal the permission to talk to Power BI. And again, those steps are all outlined very clearly in the Microsoft documentation. So, but just at a high level, the key thing with that is that you generally need to be like global admins, or the one tip I'd give you is that sometimes we see certain people do parts of the process and other people do other parts, and they can sometimes run into issues. So ideally, you do all of these steps, all the steps related to enabling Power BI, you do them all with the same user. It's usually easiest if that user is a global admin. So if you can get your hands on a global admin, do all of these steps with the same user. Otherwise, we've just seen some weird permissions things where one person enables it here, but then they can't see the workspaces, and it's just kind of a mess. So find one global admin, go through all the whole process with that same user account. That's the one tip I would give. So yeah, once you get that set up, then like I said, you can go into the components and Power BI shows up here in the list. And so again, you can use Liquid. I don't know why I just quickly bring up that Power BI Liquid tag. So here's the Microsoft documentation. So it's basically just Power BI. Again, authentication type, we've got Power BI embedded. You've got the path to the report. And all it does is when you go into here is that if you've properly connected your thing, when you click on and add a Power BI, it will actually connect directly to Power BI and just give you the drop downs of which reports you want to do, so you don't have to grab those IDs. Otherwise, you just have to kind of know what these IDs are. If you need this URL in order to kind of drop them in there. So Yeah, if we go into for developers, work with liquid templates, liquid available liquid tags. I think this is where Power BI is. Yeah, so Power BI. So you can see here the parameters, the path. We're always going to need the path to the report. The authentication type, like we talked about. Anonymous, that's the publish to web. AAD is if we're using Azure Active Directory. Again, that's mostly for the employee self-service portal or the Power BI embedded. And then we get into the URL filters, which, as I mentioned, you can include these filters on there. And that will do the filtering, but again, it's something that is easily hackable, I guess would be one way of putting it. And they're saying the anonymous reports don't support the filtering in the thing. So you can do the filters in client-side JavaScript. So I'll talk about that in a second. And then the other thing here is the roles. The roles are important for Power BI embedded only. And essentially just when you're doing your role level security, you do have to supply a role. Often that's just one role. We often just call that role users, and so we supply that. Because we find most typically all the permissions and stuff are handled based on the role level security, but it is possible to have these kind of different roles based on the web roles. They've given you some things here where you just use Liquid to generate those. But those are kind of the main parameters for that Power BI. The other thing is that once you get to that thing on the page, let me just go back to this. Microsoft has some great documentation on using the Power BI client JavaScript library on the portal. So a very common request is to want to hide the little filters area that shows up on the left. And often there'll be the pages, so the tabs along the bottom. Often there's just one, so you just want to hide that because it's just taking up space. So they've got an example of using the Power BI API, the client-side API, on how to turn those off. So you can use the Power BI client-side API to interact with your reports, and those are on there as well. So that's a good example. And this is a piece of code that is, most of our projects we just kind of drop on there because it hides the filters and the navigation. So when we talk about passing those filters on the query string, what people do is they just set this visible to false. And they're like, oh, now it's secure. It's like, well, all someone has to do is change that to true, and now they can see your filters, and you uncheck a bunch of things, and you start seeing everyone's data. So that's kind of the security problem with that. Just checking out the questions here from Jim. Could we leverage the org team user permissions ownership model of Dynamics Dataverse for this? The short answer is no, because the person the person who's on the portal is a contact, and so they're not going to have the ownership of anything. The other thing to know is that Power BI doesn't respect anything like entity or table permissions, so you really have to consider Power BI to be its own separate permissions thing that you have to tackle. I mean, could you, in theory, in your Power BI respect entity permissions or table permissions? You could, if you want to kind of go through that effort. But just as a general rule, like, no, it's like you get the username, you get the username of the contact, and then from there, all the security is based on that. I guess in theory, if you were using the Azure Active Directory permissions, maybe there's some opportunities there, but not something we've ever kind of investigated. We've always treated the Power BI permissions as kind of a completely separate beast. All right, so that's kind of Power BI again. Honestly, the vast majority of the work here is writing Power BI reports. Not something that I get involved with a lot. Usually it's someone else. We've got Power BI experts that write the reports. And then from the portal perspective, it's going through the setup process. I mean, I think I did one earlier this week, and it takes, I don't know, 15 minutes if you have all the right permissions to kind of go through, create the groups, enable things. Usually most of the time you're just waiting for these screens to load, especially recently. So it's a pretty straightforward process to add it. But so it's like an hour or two to get it onto the portal, and then it's like, I don't know, how long can you spend writing Power BI reports? You can spend the rest of your life on a Power BI report. So that's kind of the challenge with Power BI. But the key thing is when you're looking at this going into a project and say, how are we going to do our reports with Power BI? If you've got an external audience, I mean, you're going to most likely be going down Power BI embedded. So make sure you're aware of the costs of that, because it is, I believe, I'm not the pricing expert, but I believe it's thousands of dollars a month to get Power BI embedded. So it's not like, oh, I pay my $10 for my Power BI Pro, I'm going to put it on the portal. To get it on the portal, you've got thousands of dollars a month to get that going. and then just kind of understand that, yes, you can drop those on the portal. That's pretty easy. You got the licensing, the security is, I think, often overlooked as well. People kind of, they don't quite understand how the row level security works. So that's the other thing, is that if you've got experienced Power BI resources, then just explain to them that, yes, it's row level security. You're going to get this information on the contact table. Make sure you're basing your permissions on that. All right. I don't see any other questions on Power BI. So I'm going to hop back to the slides, and I'm going to move to the next topic, which is using Liquid or the Web API. So this is something we do all the time as well. And that is, there are Liquid tags, or like I mentioned, you in theory could use the Web API now. Not something we've really done much of with the read APIs for this sort of thing, because server side just seems to be, you get that immediate, when the page loads, your data's there versus kind of waiting for an asynchronous operation. But there's essentially kind of three main ways that we will use to create a dashboard-like experience. So there is the chart tag. So if you are building charts in your model-driven apps in Dynamics, those charts, for the most part, can be displayed on a portal. There is a certain list of certain types of reports. I think donut is one of them. So there's certain report types that aren't supported on the portal, or chart types that aren't supported on the portal. But I would say there's 80–90% of the chart types are supported on the portal. So there's a Liquid tag that you can use where you basically point it at the ID of the chart, and you point it at the ID of the view that you want to use for the filtering of the data on that chart. And you put that on your portal, and that will display the chart. We've also got Liquid tags to display an entity list. We've also got Liquid tags that allow us to do fetch XML queries so that we can count records and display them. So when we talk about a dashboard on a portal, it's important to understand that you can build dashboards in Dynamics and in your model-driven app, but the portal will not display that. There's no tag to take a portal or a dashboard that you've built in a model-driven app and display it on the portal. So what you have to do is you essentially have to craft them yourselves. A lot of the components that you can build into a dashboard, like the charts, like the lists, we've got them, but you kind of have to craft them yourself. So I'll just kind of show you an example, a very quick example of how that might look. So if I go back to here, just so that you didn't have to see me fumble around too much with my chart, what I did is I started off and I have a page here where I've got a very basic chart. If I open up, I'm using my XRM toolbox to display the chart. I'm just going to get latest here, make sure. So you can see that the chart Liquid tag is pretty simple. Chart, the ID of the chart, and the ID of the view that we want to use. If I go back over here, I created this chart that says full name by full name, very cleverly named. And all I did was I grabbed the ID from the query string here that says, hey, here's the ID of the chart. You can also, if you're looking at the chart, and this is what I think the Microsoft documentation shows, if you're looking at the chart in a model-driven app or in Dynamics, there's like an export button that will give you the XML for that chart, and that will include the ID in it as well. But essentially, you just grab this ID, and then you go and you find the view that you want it to filter on, and you grab the ID of that one using a similar technique. If you just browse to it in make.powerapps.com, you'll get the ID in the query string. And those are the two parameters that you feed into your thing. So you say, here's the ID of my chart, here's the view I want to filter, you click save, and you're going to get something that looks like this. So important to know that this does apply filtering of the entity permissions or table permissions as well. So it's similar to how a list works. When you're looking at a list, it's filtering both on whatever filter criteria is defined in that view that's driving that list, as well as the table or entity permissions. So with a chart, the same thing, you have to provide it a view. So it's going to apply whatever filtering is in that view, but it's also going to apply any entity or table permissions on top of that. So now we got this chart on the page. I mean, yeah, it looks great. Is it a dashboard? No, it's just kind of a chart at this point. So what can we do? Well, we can use Bootstrap to kind of lay out a dashboard in different ways. So Bootstrap has our columns. So for example, I could say div class equals row, and I could start saying div class equals call MD4, and that's going to give me 1/3 layout on my chart because Bootstrap works in a 12-column layout. So if I just do this, we'll see if the cache and validation gods are in my favor today or not. Not quite. All right, let's do this the old-fashioned way. So I'm going to do this. This should clear the cache for that particular page. And now I've got my little chart over here. So I'm going to be lazy and not create 3 separate charts, but I'm just going to copy this, and you can probably imagine how if you change the ID and created 3 different charts, and we've got the 3 in there like that, and I go back to my thing here, go back there, browse website. Now I'm going to see 3 charts on there. Now that kind of looks like a dashboard. Probably would look better if the charts were different, but again, change some IDs in there, and I think you get the picture. Now that's just charts. What else can we include on these things? Well, we've got liquid tags that allow us to put an entity list in. So you could drop a little entity list. You're probably going to be careful about how many columns you show. So maybe 2 or 3 columns if you want to put it in here, or a full, you could have one that kind of covers up this two sides of this, and you can just drop using liquid an entity list tag in here. So now you've got a chart and a list here. All right, what else can we do? Often what we get there's certain KPIs, like those key indicators. So like how many cases have you submitted in the last 30 days? And you'll show that you'll show a big number that says, hey, you've submitted 3 cases, and you want to show that in a big number. Well, we can use fetch XML liquid tag to grab those numbers, and then again, we're just using HTML to put them on the page. So I won't get into a full example, but as an example, you can go fetch XML. Let's just say KPI. So then you do your fetch XML here, fetch XML. So you do your query, and then you just create a div that has the output of your query. You can do aggregates. You can do a whole bunch of things in your fetch XML query, and then here you just do like KPI dot, I forget what is it, results dot entities. I forget the exact syntax, but then you can just like, if you're doing an aggregate, it's usually in here, and then you could say like sum or whatever you happen to put in as your alias on the field that came back. So basically you do your fetch XML, and then you just output those things. You could put this in a nice fancy box. You could put this in a Bootstrap panel, do whatever you want. But now you can do charts. You can do these big kind of KPIs. You can do your entity lists. If you want to get it even a little bit fancier, you can incorporate, like we've seen people bring in other JavaScript libraries like HighChart or some of these other charting libraries. So it's like if you've got the data and you can get the data using fetch XML, or again, you can use it, get it using the web API. If you can get the data, then it's all just kind of client side. So how can you display these different types of reports client side, or these different kind of charts? Well, if you've got a third-party JavaScript library that you can include, well, there you go as well. So this is the road that we typically go down. Again, no extra cost to this other than the work to do it, but there's no ongoing licensing costs associated with this sort of technique, because all of this is just using a kind of out-of-the-box model-driven app dynamics things. So this is something that I would say is it's pretty standard for us to say, okay, when someone logs into your portal, they're going to go to a screen. What's all the different things we can show on the screen? That's going to be like the user's dashboard. So that's very common. Even in cases where we're doing Power BI, we're often doing something like that as well. Any questions about using Liquid and potentially web API to build out a dashboard like that? I'm not seeing any in the chat, but please do drop those in if you do have any. All right. Last thing I want to talk about was just the third-party tool. I'm going to say it's probably possible. I haven't done it, but I'm assuming that Microsoft doesn't completely own the space of like be able to embed reports on a thing. I know Google has some options. I know there's Tableau. There's lots of things out there. So the thing that comes to mind there is how do you properly authenticate that? Because for Power BI, the way that Microsoft securely authenticates the Power BI embedded stuff is it's using server-side code. And that's not something that you have direct access to. So that's the one thing I'd be looking into. If you say, hey, yeah, I can embed a Tableau or whatever it is onto my portal, great, but how do I give it in the context of that user, and how do I do that in a secure way that's not just some query string parameter on the report URL that anyone could just change. For these types of purposes, Microsoft has the OAuth implicit grant flow support, where the portal can generate a token. You can pass that token to the service, and it will include the information about the user. It'll give you the ID of the contact who's logged in. So that's what I would look into is, can you somehow incorporate the OAuth implicit grant flow's ability to get a token, so you can retrieve a token from the service. That token includes claims about who's logged in, and can you pass that to that other service? Could that other service consume them and use that? So again, using some third-party tools, probably possible. Haven't been down the road, but yeah. Oh, I see a question here. So if we have an address on our accounts, could we use Power BI to show them live on a map? Absolutely, yeah. That's very common. I wouldn't know how to show something on a map, but I've seen it done hundreds of times, so I know it is possible. So you could definitely use Power BI to, I know they have map functionality. You could point it at the account table. It would show it on the map, all that sort of stuff. So absolutely, you could do that. All right, so yeah, that's kind of all I really want to say on third-party tool. The big thing that jumps out at me is how do you do the authentication properly? Because Microsoft has kind of built their own tool into it, so that's what's great about the Power BI integration. So you'd have to figure out how do you do that securely for a third-party tool. Okay, so that kind of covers when we see reports and dashboards. The two main techniques we're using is it Power BI or is it not Power BI? If it's not Power BI, what can we do with Liquid or potentially the web API to get those kind of interfaces built out? We've got our next call scheduled for April 28th. If you have any topic suggestions, certainly open to those. Honestly, that's the thing that I struggle with the most, and that's why often I send out the emails late because I'm like, I got to pick a topic. Well, what do people want to hear about this month? So if you do have any topics, please let me know. As always, Mr. Gumpert, Jason at NMS Dynamics World, thank you for your support. And I will just leave it at, are there any other questions?